Trade negotiations between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump left many investors disappointed as Canada remains the only G7 country without a trade deal with the United States. This puts Canada in a precarious position and suggests the country may need to move away from the trilateral CUSMA agreement and instead deepen its trade ties with Mexico.
What if the two neighbors America depends on most, Canada and Mexico, decided to depend on each other instead? Across North America, trade lines are being redrawn. What began as Donald Trump's attempt to dominate the continent through tariffs is now shifting power in unexpected ways. His effort to force manufacturing back to American soil has pushed Canada and Mexico to look toward one another. For decades, Washington stood at the center of North America's supply chains, but Trump's wave of import duties and industrial credits has fractured that system. What was meant to bring control has instead created a new corridor of power stretching from Montreal to Mexico City, two nations learning to work without Washington's approval. The White House's goal was clear. Trump wanted to break apart the trilateral structure of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or CUSMA, and replace it with one-on-one deals that gave the U.S. maximum leverage. Instead, the pressure has done the opposite. It has pulled Canada and Mexico into closer alignment. After months of tariff battles, steel, autos, heavy trucks, and aluminum, the United States now faces the slow isolation of its own supply network. Factories that once depended on seamless cross-border production are now dealing with paperwork, higher costs, and shrinking margins. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned in early October that prolonged tariffs risk higher inflation and supply bottlenecks, while the World Trade Organization cautioned that the trade war could cut global GDP growth by more than half a percentage point if it continues into 2026. Rather than fight for individual deals with Washington, Ottawa and Mexico City have begun coordinating policy and investment. Trump's divide-and-conquer approach has become the trigger for regional cooperation. What was once a three-way partnership centered on the U.S. is now splitting into two, Canada and Mexico on one side, Washington on the other. On September 17, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a strategic partnership and a Canada-Mexico Action Plan 2025-2028. The announcement came as Trump prepared new 25% tariffs on heavy trucks effective November 1. The plan deepens cooperation in agriculture, healthcare, energy, and infrastructure, while keeping trade between Canada and Mexico tariff-free. Canada will send its agriculture minister to Mexico next month, followed by a trade mission led by Minister Dominic LeBlanc. Both governments will also expand security coordination against gun smuggling, drug trafficking, and fentanyl. Ironically, fentanyl was one of Trump's main justifications for his own tariff policy. Carney called this a new era of cooperation, a sign that Canada and Mexico are building reliability in a world where the U.S. is no longer predictable. According to Statistics Canada, about 75% of Canada's exports in 2024 went to the United States. That dependence leaves Ottawa exposed each time Washington changes its rules. Partnership with Mexico offers a safety valve. It connects Canada to lower-cost labor, diversified logistics through Pacific and Atlantic ports, and a new route into Latin America and Asia via the CPTPP. Mexico gains from Canadian capital and advanced manufacturing expertise. J.P. Morgan analysts estimate that redirecting even 5 to 10% of exports from the U.S. to Mexico could stabilize Canadian manufacturing during trade disruptions. The corridor isn't an act of protest, it's a way to survive the volatility of Trump's tariff era.
This realignment began early in 2025 when the Trump administration imposed new import duties under Section 232, citing national security. The move added a 25% tariff on heavy trucks and 35% on key auto components. In April, Stellantis shifted Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois, a $13 billion investment that created 5,000 U.S. jobs but cut 3,000 in Canada. It was a symbolic victory for Trump's reshoring agenda and a shock for Ontario's manufacturing belt. By mid-year, Canada was the only G7 nation without a trade deal with Washington. Investors reacted. The Canadian dollar fell to a 3-year low, and unemployment rose to 7.1%, according to Statistics Canada's September data. Instead of retaliating, Carney held back. Ottawa skipped counter-tariffs and turned its focus south, to Mexico. That decision now defines Canada's new playbook: build strength through cooperation, not confrontation.
What started as a tariff war has turned into a regional reset. Trump's economic walls were meant to protect American jobs, but they've redirected trade around them. Canada and Mexico are quietly building an economic corridor linking industries, ports, and supply chains, an alliance that could lessen Washington's gravitational pull on the continent. With the 2026 CUSMA review approaching, the two partners are already aligned for whatever comes next. For now, one fact stands out. When Trump tried to split North America, he didn't just fracture trade lines, he created a new one. A line that runs not through the United States, but around it.
You know, President Trump wants to come after the jobs and create uncertainty, not only in Canada, but across the world.
And we're going to begin in Washington, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading for yet another high-stakes meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. A critical moment as Canada is seeking tariff relief.
The days before one of the year's most anticipated meetings, the mood in Washington feels tense. Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing to meet U.S. President Donald Trump on October 7, his second trip to the White House since taking office. Back home, critics demand results. In Ottawa, his team chooses every word carefully. But before Carney even boards his flight, the story shifts. In Quebec City, at the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Conference, several American governors from Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania speak out against the tariffs, straining relations between their country and Canada. They remind everyone that more than 55 million jobs depend on the cross-border economy. These are not foreign observers. They are Trump's own partners, warning that his trade policies are hurting their communities. For years, Trump has described tariffs as proof of strength. Now, those same policies are drawing resistance from inside America. What was meant to pressure Canada is starting to pressure Washington itself. As Carney prepares for the meeting, he carries with him the unexpected support of U.S. governors who have publicly stood with Canada.
You know, we are friends, we're allies.
Canada got some support from a delegation of governors from Great Lakes states, all of which are closely tied to the Canadian economy.
What is not helpful is the way in which the president has demeaned our neighbors in the north, suggesting that they should be the 51st state. I respect Canadian sovereignty.
The reason is simple economics. The Great Lakes region is one of the most integrated industrial corridors in the world. The auto industry, steel producers, and aluminum smelters on both sides of the border operate as a single system. When tariffs slice through that network, they don't separate rivals from friends. They break the same machine both depend on. In automobiles, for example, a single North American car crosses the border several times before reaching the showroom. Parts made in Windsor often travel to Detroit for assembly and return to Ontario for finishing. Each tariff on metals or components adds cost at every crossing. For factories in Michigan and Ohio, that means higher prices and slower schedules. The metals that feed those plants tell the same story. Canada supplies roughly 90% of the primary aluminum imported by the United States, most used in cars and aircraft. Steel from Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie becomes the raw material for mills in Illinois and Pennsylvania. When Washington taxes those imports at 25 to 50%, U.S. manufacturers pay more for materials they cannot source domestically. Energy links reinforce the dependency. Pipelines and power lines cross the border daily, keeping refineries and auto plants running. Ontario and Quebec rely on U.S. natural gas, while American states rely on Canadian electricity and oil. The supply chain moves in both directions. That is why the governors of Michigan, Minnesota, and New York are alarmed. Every new tariff threatens thousands of local jobs, from assembly lines in Detroit to ports along Lake Superior. Even brief disruptions ripple through transport and retail. By defending Canada, these governors are protecting their own voters. They know that punishing Canada means punishing themselves. Their message is practical. Keep the border open or risk breaking an economy that sustains both nations. For Carney, that shared interest transforms his trip. He represents not only Canada, but an industrial region stretching from Ontario's auto belt to Ohio's steel towns. Out of that conference emerges a quiet but powerful alliance. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford and Quebec's Premier François Legault stand with their U.S. counterparts to stress cooperation over confrontation. For decades, the Great Lakes region has functioned as one economy. Cars assembled in Detroit rely on parts from Windsor. Aluminum from Quebec feeds aerospace plants in New York. This regional unity gives Carney an advantage ahead of his meeting. He can present himself not as a foreign petitioner, but as a partner speaking for a shared industrial base. The governor's support offers political cover and moral leverage in Washington. Across the Midwest, workers and business owners are realizing that their prosperity depends on the same open border that Trump's tariffs are closing.
In Washington, Carney's team is finalizing briefing notes for the October 7 meeting. According to CBC News and Radio Canada, the main goal is partial relief on steel tariffs and a framework for future reductions. Officials are careful not to raise expectations. Trump's unpredictability is well known in Ottawa. The White House is also under pressure from a partial government shutdown and business groups warning of higher costs. Within that environment, Carney will argue that Canada is a trusted ally whose industries are vital to U.S. growth and security. His leverage comes from three fronts. First, critical minerals. Canada supplies nickel, cobalt, and lithium, all listed by the U.S. Department of Defense as strategic. Second, defense spending. Carney's plan to expand Canada's military budget by tens of billions could translate into contracts for U.S. suppliers if trade tensions ease. Third, political support from U.S. governors urging tariff relief. Trump still holds the power to adjust or keep duties under Section 232, but rising frustration from border states makes a limited compromise possible. Analysts expect any early progress to center on aluminum, where U.S. factories rely heavily on Canadian imports. Lumber, tied to domestic politics, will likely remain unchanged. As the meeting nears, the real question is not whether Carney secures everything he wants, but whether Trump can afford to keep everything he has. Whatever happens on October 7, the political landscape in North America has already shifted. Trump's tariffs, once seen as a display of power, are now testing his own coalition. The Governors' Conference in Quebec City was a warning that economic pain does not stop at the border. In a region so integrated, punishing a neighbor often means punishing yourself. For Canada, this week is a moment to prove that patience and strategy can outlast bluster. Carney is entering the talks with a clear message that Canada's strength lies not only in its resources, but in its relationships with workers, businesses, and now with American leaders who see their futures linked to its success. The tariff war of 2025 has no victors yet, but the debate has changed. When American governors stand beside Canadian premiers to defend a shared economy, it signals a new kind of politics, one that recognizes the real battle is not between nations, but between cooperation and self-inflicted harm. As the White House meeting draws near, both countries wait. For Trump, the choice is whether to double down or step back. For Carney, the test is whether he can turn growing American frustration into meaningful relief. And for millions of workers across the Great Lakes, the stakes could not be clearer. Their jobs and the future of North America's economy now depend on what happens next in Washington.
Forget about President Trump. The guy drives me crazy. Let's focus on what we can do. We're going to continue growing, continue investing in the film industry. The film industry is very strong here. Let's start putting money back into people's pockets. Put money back into companies. Make it the most competitive area anywhere in the entire world.
In late September, Ontario Premier Doug Ford openly dismissed President Trump's proposed tariff on foreign films. Ford's message was blunt. Ontario has built a screen industry worth about $3 billion, with a clear ambition to grow to $5 billion. For him, the focus should be on expanding opportunity at home rather than chasing after disruptive policies south of the border. This clash over films might sound like a niche dispute, but it tells a larger story. Under Trump's second term, tariffs have become the centerpiece of U.S. economic policy, stretching far beyond steel, aluminum, or autos. From early 2025, Canada and Mexico face 25 to 35% duties on non-compliant goods. Europe agreed to a 15% ceiling on cars and parts, while China continues to face a 55% wall. Against that backdrop, the idea of taxing films is not an isolated measure. It fits a broader strategy of squeezing allies for leverage. Yet in this case, the cultural economy at stake does not respond the way traditional industries do. The problem begins with definition. In a globalized film economy, one project can be financed in Los Angeles, shot in Toronto, animated in Bangalore, and released worldwide. How do you decide which is foreign? In an era where streaming has eclipsed box offices, enforcement becomes murky. Would a platform pay tariffs on every series filmed outside the United States? Studios will adapt by rerouting production budgets to countries offering stability. Ford highlighted Ontario's response: create a competitive environment, cut taxes, and market local talent. With skilled crews and infrastructure, the province is ready to catch projects uncertain about U.S. policy. The industry already generates $3 billion and aims at $5 billion, positioning Ontario as a safe harbor if Washington creates confusion. Cultural tariffs rarely stay in isolation. Other countries have tools to retaliate, whether through quotas, subsidies, or promotional budgets that encourage global productions to avoid the United States. For U.S. distributors, a thinner pipeline of international content means fewer choices for consumers and higher costs without necessarily adding new American jobs. Meanwhile, Canada is pushing diversification. In the past year, Ontario attracted over $40 billion of investment across sectors, and Ford has emphasized growing ties with Europe and the United Kingdom. That same approach now applies to film. If U.S. trade walls rise, productions will not simply shrink, they will move. Toronto and Vancouver already host a large share of Hollywood shoots because of cost advantages and predictability. Adding political uncertainty in Washington only strengthens Canada's hand. For Trump, the short-term optics are powerful. A tariff on foreign films sounds like a bold defense of American culture, but the economic reality is less favorable. 3 scenarios emerge. If the tariff is fully imposed, international studios will gain the rules and shift even more spending to Canada or Europe, leaving U.S. job gains minimal. If the White House negotiates carve-outs, the symbolism remains, but most projects reroute through exemptions, weakening credibility. If the policy is shelved under pressure, the uncertainty has already nudged productions to hedge their bets outside the U.S. In all 3 cases, the effect looks less like protection and more like acceleration of Canada's strategy. Ford's comments underscore that lesson. By focusing on building conditions for growth at home, Ontario turns a hostile policy abroad into fuel for expansion. The broader takeaway is clear. When tariffs target culture without clear definitions, markets adapt faster than politicians expect. Instead of restoring American dominance, the proposal risks backfiring by strengthening the very neighbor it was meant to pressure.